It is necessary for the recording of sound to convert the sound waves to corresponding changes in light. The sound waves produced by my voice are transmitted through the air to the microphone, where these sound waves are converted to changes in an electric current. These variations in the electric current are then amplified and used to control the light. This varying beam of light falling on the photoelectric cell produces variations in the electric current, which are directly proportional to the variations in the light beam. The sound track. As the varying electrical current in the photoelectric cell is small, a vacuum tube amplifier is required to increase it to the point where it will operate a loudspeaker. Sound track.
Welcome to the Occult Rejects. This episode, I am very, very happy to have this guest on, and really, I was really lucky to actually even have this chance. His publicist happened to actually hit me up and suggest him, and when I looked into the latest book that he had put out, I thought this guy could not have been really a better guest than, because due to the stuff that we're even covering recently. I know for the fans and the listeners, a few weeks ago, by the time this comes out, you will have probably heard us talk about some of the people that we are going to talk about in this episode, but I think a little bit more detailed. And I was really happy to be able to talk to somebody else that was covering these people and maybe had a little bit of the same ideas or was going in the same areas with them. They kind of thought a little bit of the same. So I was even happy to think okay, I'm not that crazy. Some of these ideas, and I really think it's actually a really good book, and I was hoping that eventually we'll get into a little bit of it so he has a chance to promote it. Our guest, well, first off, I do have Lisa with me as usual. What is up, Lisa? Thank you very much for coming on.
Absolutely. Looking forward to this.
Yes, very much so. We do have the guest, Tobias Churton, if I'm saying that last name correctly. Sorry if I didn't. And he does have a new book that actually came out more recent than I thought. It came out in November. It's called The First Alchemists, The Spiritual and Practical Origins of the Noble and Holy Art. Now, if people remember, not too long ago, I did talk about Mary the Jewess and Zosimos, and they were alchemists, and I did go into a little bit of them because I thought that they were interesting characters that maybe a lot of people didn't even know would exist. And he has done, I think, a little bit more extensive research into them and into alchemy. So I'm going to shut up, and I'm going to let Tobias introduce himself and just let people know maybe, a little bit about himself and what got him into this. Tobias, thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Oh, introduce myself. Hello to all those who are interested in this podcast. I've spent my adult life exploring every aspect, I think, of the Gnostic traditions, including alchemy, Rosicrucianism, Freemasonry, so-called occultism, aspects of astrology, tarot, magical revivals of one sort or another, Aleister Crowley particularly. I've written a 6-volume definitive biography of Crowley, and also of Gurdjieff. I've written a biography of Gurdjieff and Lars Ashmole, and one of my favorites, William Blake. I wanted to write the definitive biography of the great visionary artist, William Blake, and my aim is to break through the mythology that surrounds these people and the confusion and obscurity that besets the spiritual traditions of the Western world, and to banish the mythology and to show what we're really talking about, and then allow people to make up their own minds as to the value of this extraordinary tradition, which academically we call Western esotericism. And esotericism simply means to go within as opposed to staying without. So you can either stand outside the exciting party, or you can go within, and then the more you go into an interesting group of people, the deeper you go. Or as John Lennon put it, the higher you fly, the deeper you go. So esotericism is simply a more profound acquaintance with spiritual matters and spiritual truth. So it obviously enters into perceptions of every religion or spiritual philosophy in the world. So there's an esoteric tradition in Buddhism, there's an esoteric side of Islam, there's an esoteric side of Judaism, Christianity, and even aspects of paganism are very often highly esoteric. The trouble with esotericism is that because of the difficulty of depth penetrating spiritual thought, the opportunities for confusion and exaggeration are enormous, and many people get lost on the way. And my books and my life has been dedicated to clarifying the way and showing that these things don't glow in the dark, they're nothing to be frightened of, and it isn't irrational and weird. We're talking about human beings understanding themselves from a spiritual perspective. How you understand the word spiritual is very personal, but I think we all have an idea of it.
I think that was like so well said, what you just said right there. And I think that's a lot of the reasons why we've even covered some specific people is like in the work that they've done. There was some people that we did cover that I thought were pointing at saying that there is a kind of a misconception where people are starting to they thought alchemy was more of like an actual interchange instead of like so much of people turning lead into gold, and like even saying that a lot of gods or art is actually just humanized alchemy archetypes in a sense. I don't know if I'm saying it correctly, but I do think like I do find it interesting how I think in some of your work, I think you do also kind of, from what I got out of it, do entertain that alchemy can be many things actually, you know, many levels to understanding alchemy in a sense. So what do you think alchemy is to you?
Well,
I mean, if that's too deep of a question, I guess the best answer you can give us.
I'll see what. Let's see what emerges from the mouth in this. Alchemy is simply the Arabic word for chemistry, and that's and alchemy in its original form, which is what my book is about, is chemistry. It's metallurgical chemistry. It's how to manipulate chemical processes. That's what it's about. What it became and what it's become, very, very different. And there are clear reasons for that. Carl Jung, the great alienist, as they used to call psychologists in those days,
Yes.
the great alienist, has a lot to answer for where alchemy is concerned. He wrote a book called Psychology and Alchemy in 1943 in Switzerland, and it came out in the war, so very few people had the time to read it, but its influence is very much a post-war thing. And Carl Jung is a wonderful chap, and he understood certain spiritual dynamics very well. But he was trying to make a case that far from being a pseudoscience, alchemy presupposed certain understandings of his psychology. And this has entered into the mainstream of post-war discourse on alchemy and has had a terrible effect, in my opinion. While it's attracted a lot of people, the subject, and that's not a terrible effect, it has distorted the view that people think they're dealing with some kind of highly abstract metaphysical mystery that really relates to the psyche. In other words, the alchemists were more interested in spiritual changes or psychological transformations in their own brain and their own consciousness than they were in actually getting to grips with metallurgical chemistry. And that effect has been remarkable, more so because of the 1960s rediscovery of certain kinds of spirituality. And in that, those people who've been attracted to 1960s spirituality and as it's developed in the last 40 and 50 years, are attracted to alchemy really because they're looking for a kind of psychic path, or a spiritual path, certainly. And it is because of the confusion of these psychic spiritual categories that I wrote the book, because I wanted to clarify what the hell this alchemy really is about. And in order to do that, you've got to go back to the original and most ancient sources that we have, which is what I do in the book, which are mainly the Leiden papyrus, called so after the University of Leiden in Holland, where a lot of early alchemical papyri were lodged, and the Stockholm papyrus, obviously, was lodged in Stockholm. These were lodged there before the middle of the 19th century, having been discovered in the area of Thebes in Egypt. And the manuscript, the papyrus dates from about the 4th century, so late Roman Empire, when the Romans were still just about governing and just about holding on to Egypt. And but the texts themselves, we think, with the best certainty, were composed around the 1st century. That is the time of Jesus and the Jewish revolt against the Romans. So we have a fairly narrow perspective on the early alchemists. We're talking about developments that were happening in the 1st century BC, in the 1st century in the Common Era or Christian era.
Right.
And what we've discovered from those documents is that they were simply recipes for making objects, mostly votive objects or sculptures, make them look like gold and silver. Not to turn anything into gold and silver, but these were brilliant craft attempts to imitate perfectly the effects of gold and silver. There was, of course, no chemical certainty in those days about what was an elemental silver or gold. If it looked like gold and it behaved like gold and people were convinced it was gold, it was gold. Now, some of the practitioners over time probably convinced themselves that they'd made gold, or yellow was the phrase they'd use, yellow, or what you talk about, the yellowing and the whitening, which in medieval and Renaissance alchemy are regarded as stages within the production of the Philosopher's Stone. But actually, the whitening was what they were after. Whitening meant to make silver, and the yellowing was to make gold. And they were incredibly skillful. What I found we're really talking about in the origin of alchemy is a minor, perhaps more than that, industrial revolution in Upper Egypt, made possible because of the discovery in the 1st century BC, as late as that. I was amazed to find that glass blowing was to my mind, a late industrial development. And once you could use glass and blow these vessels, chemicals reacted totally differently with glass than they did with the earlier lead vessels or earthenware vessels, because every chemical change depended entirely on what it was contained in, whether it was contained in a copper bowl or an iron bowl or whatever it was. That actually created the chemical change. Now, that I know that's not music to the ears of a lot of people who see alchemy as a quintessence of Gnostic philosophy, but that's what we're talking about. And to show how an industrial process and industry became a mythology of spiritual transformation is another part of my book. And the point of it is to show how these conceptions of the Philosopher's Stone and so forth emerged. out of a very practical and fundamentally scientific process.
So this is essentially proto-chemistry, right? Is what
I don't even think it's. I don't think it's fair to call it proto-chemistry.
Okay.
It's chemistry. Proto-chemistry suggests somehow that it's a kind of primitive version of something later. Obviously, they didn't have the scientific method philosophy that Francis Bacon had or René Descartes had. It was it was a craft. It was an art and craft. It was called the most noble art. The most noble art. They thought it was the most noble art because they were dealing with the inner nature of materials, and to be able to manipulate the inner nature of materials by heating, by evaporation, by distillation. These were revolutionary changes. Right. They didn't use. They weren't trying to drain, as in modern science, we drained our practical science of spiritual meaning. It's purely what we have in modern science is a measurable universe, and that which can be measured is scientific, and a conclusion has to be measurable numerically, and therefore mathematically consistent. We're dealing in this period with what they used to describe as recipes, and we're talking about cooking. Right. In a similar spirit to when John Lennon would be in the studio and say, "Now we're cooking," when the music's starting to happen, or any chef or any cook or anybody in the kitchen who starts to feel you get that right smell, you've got the cooking just right, it's simmering nicely. They were after a process of cooking, and what some of them had seen. Obviously, in the late Roman Empire, nothing happened without it involving some spiritual dimension, because people lived in a world that was governed by spirits, low spirits and high spirits. Right. So you have Zosimus of Panopolis writing in about 300 AD that he says, remove all this stuff about you've got to placate the spirits. It's a natural process which God has allowed us to use. It comes from heaven, yes, but you do not need to pray to idols. You do not need to invite demons to assist your work. Do it in the right way. So he's one of the, I'd say he's very close in one aspect to modern scientific method. He wants to remove the presence of invisible forces and talk about a natural but divine process. That's one of the interesting things about
it did seem like it was seamless the way he would explain it, how the divine and the actual physical was all married together, and there was no need to place an importance on one over the other because they were all interconnected. They all had this continuous thread to which they were all occurring. But like you brought up Carl Jung, and you mentioned how there was a moment where they extracted the spirituality out of alchemy, and now you have Carl Jung kind of emphasizing the spiritual aspect. Why do you think that he put so much emphasis in terms of spiritual alchemy, and why do you think he used alchemy in and of itself for his ideas or his philosophies?
That's really easy to answer, Lisa, is because he, through his analysis of people's dreams, he was surprised by how many people's dreams seem to have an alchemical analog. They seem to relate to chemical processes, and the imagery which he had seen, which is late imagery, not early Roman at all, but the medieval and Renaissance and 18th century Enlightenment period imagery of the marriage of Sol et Luna, the sun and the moon, and the sexual communion, and the nature of water, and the burning of substances. he found this in dreams, and he therefore came to the conclusion that the pictorial aspect of alchemy came from the subconscious, or unconscious as he called it, and was projected onto the physical substances. And that's given a lot of people today the idea that alchemy was, while it was happening in the vase, things were boiling, evaporating, changing, that the alchemists somehow involuntarily projected their subconscious onto this. That was his theory. I think it's nonsense. I think he got this completely wrong. I don't think they were doing this anything remotely like that. Most alchemists were either what were called the puffers in the Renaissance, who were people who were just dedicated to finding a quick way to make gold. And these recipes suggested that there was a way to make gold. Well, yes, there was indeed, but it wasn't the stuff you were going to sell at the stock market, you know. You're going to make something like gold. And I think in that sense, he was really trying to make a case for the importance of the spirit in psychological maturity. And I think that's what's important about Jung is that unlike Freud, who left us with the naked id and opened the door to Arthur Yanov and all this selfist psychology of Abraham Maslow and this whole thing that's just, you know, there's modern psychological pseudo-religion, as I regard it. He was trying to say that a true psychology, in order to heal people, must have a spiritual dimension. And when he found useful material, he was a Gnostic, as we know, Jung. He was self-confessed, Gnostic. When I met Gilles Quispel, who brought the Gnostic Gospel of Truth to him in Switzerland in the 50s, and Quispel said to me, he gave the papyrus of the Gospel of Truth to Jung, which he brought from Egypt. And Jung said, all my life I have been trying to find the secrets of the psyche, and these people knew already. So Jung had already made up his mind that the Gnostics were the kind of depth psychologists of Christianity, which is great and fascinating and interesting. And I think for the post-war generations, it's revealing and doors open. But in terms of trying to understand what alchemy was, he kind of abused the material. In an academic way abused. I don't think in any other way. I know he was utterly sincere, of course. And I mean, he was just part of the steps towards understanding it. All I wanted to do was deal with my own confusion, because when I've been studying the subject for very many years, and I was always in a double-minded, what are we really talking about here? Am I talking about some kind of, you know, projected Gnosticism, or am I talking about, you know, cooking with chemicals and making money out of objects and metallurgy? And I couldn't work it out at all. It was always coming in and out of focus. And that's why I undertook the book, because I wanted to know how it began. And once you knew how it began, you could then see how it developed. And you can say that, well, alchemy now covers all these other symbolic areas. But I think it's very important that people understand that it did not begin as a psycho-spiritual adventure. That was a layer of meaning that is gradually accreted to it through the processes of ideological history, through late Roman Empire into the Arab period, and then is inherited in medieval Europe. And I mean, in the process, of course, it does create modern chemistry. I mean, I don't know why scientists I think a lot of scientists today are beginning to understand that there were certain things that were recognized by the alchemists that modern chemistry hadn't seen.
I agree.
And these are all healthy. These are all healthy stuff. You know, we're getting a clearer view all the time My God, if it was left to the processes of pure thought, the world would be on the verge of paradise now. If we could, remove the lunatics and fanatics and trust to the kind of knowledge that's now becoming, I have this awful feeling that at the moment where we really start to understand man and the spirit and the way this really works for all people, that very moment, the whole thing's going to go up in flames. That's my greatest fear.
They're going to pull the plug and say, no, they got too close.
Yeah, it's a sort of, yes, it's a sort of slightly paranoid dream. But we have made great strides in understanding these things, I think. I think we're much more honest about these subjects than previous generations as well, I think. I think alchemy is a gateway to questioning the relationship between matter and spirit. It opens up the thought that it isn't all material any more than it's all spiritual. That there is a subtle relationship, and man stands at this crossroads of being able to see both. If he doesn't see both, then I would say he sees nothing.
I would agree with that.
Something I was thinking, and I think it might have been something I heard you say when I was listening to a show that you were on, or something they said, but it started making me think, even, like, it depends, I guess, what people think, but, I do believe, like, there is a spirit, and then there's, the body or whatever, and at some point there is a version of me, I guess, that's not in this meat suit. I might have been in the spirit before I came into the body, and, like, I think that whole thing right there is alchemical in a sense. So it's like I forgot exactly what was said, but it was something almost like existence is almost alchemical, or alchemy. Really, if you understand what I'm trying to get at, there would have to be some sort of...
I think that, the universe can be conceived of as an alchemical process.
Yes, yeah. Creation.
Yeah, because we are chemical beings. And let's be clear what we mean by chemical again. Where does this word come from? This word chemical, chemistry, alchemy. Al is just the Arabic word for the. Yeah. So alchemy is simply the chemistry, if you like. But obviously the word chemistry for us probably means a hard lesson at school and an examination. What they were referring to, all the evidence points to the root word of the chem, the kum, is related to something that is burnt, something that is black, something that is, in other words, carbonized substance. I think what we're talking about is the art of heat, what heat does, which is also related to passion, of course. Mm-hmm. My God, you call somebody, hey, they're hot, right? Meaning they're about to happen. Is a hot star or a hot guy or a hot girl, ready, energy, right? So alchemy is the art of heat. What happens to substance when it's brought to a sufficient state of excitement? That is what it is about. That is the whole thing. If you put heat under a substance, you get evaporation. Mm-hmm. And they were this is this wonderful analogy that you've taken a solid substance and through heating it, up it goes in the vase. It then lands on the vessel at the top, and it cools, and it's different. Now, you think of the idea in the Bible of and the religious tradition of the ascension. A cloud removed him from their sight, as Acts says of Jesus ascending. So I think there's an alchemy there. You have a human being whose nature is able to become invisible and visible. It can coalesce, it can become invisible. And people could see this who knew about it in the alchemical processes. So the sun comes up, it rises, and it becomes something different at a higher level. So there was always a spiritual analogy. And this is the very important thing. One has to realize that spirituality and materiality are of the same order. That is the fundamental necessity that we have, a vision that we have lost. The material world, the spiritual world are one world. They're not, you can't really separate them, but you can perceive them as separate, but they're going on all the time. That's how it is. So the visible becomes invisible, the visible becomes invisible. What appears to be one thing can rise and become something else. So you are talking about a kind of I mean, Jakob Boehme, the German mystic, talked about the universe as a perpetual alchemical operation. And they began, and in the Renaissance, certain alchemists, Malcolm Meyer, probably one of them, began to see that the saving nature of Christ, the miraculous hand of God, was visible in processes of healing. And healing took place when something that was dark, black, and rotten became healthy again. And so the fundamental processes of change became associated with alchemy. Now, in the late 18th century, and certainly in the 19th, the spiritual dimension of the chemistry is lost, and it becomes purely material. And I think we lost a great deal. I think I reacted. I found myself not to be alone. I was born in 1960. It appeared to me that the new universe that was being created by science and education in the Western world, the technocracy, had abandoned the spiritual viewpoint altogether. And bringing alchemy back in, which people like Allen Ginsberg were talking about, and a lot of 60s guys, they had a very loose idea of it, but they had an idea that, you know, alchemy was actually a transformative philosophy which would make a better world. Now, I think that's underlying an aspect of our culture. It hasn't penetrated to the top in any sense. There's a whole scientific vanguard that doesn't want these concepts. They're too vague, and they deal with the immeasurable. And I would simply say that if you confine reality to what we can measure, you're going to have a very narrow reality.
I would agree. It's just that they haven't found the scale to measure it with. And
therefore the scale to measure the alchemical is simply
yes.
what you feel is working. That's why it's so like cooking rather. Right. You know, a good alchemical recipe is like cooking or making love. It's entirely between whoever's doing it, what it means. Its magical potential depends entirely on the readiness of the participants to experience that change.
Right. You mentioned something about with Cleopatra. You mentioned her in your book, and I covered her a little bit. And with her gold making one page, I guess like kind of like a recipe or almost like a puzzle. She kind of touched upon that there was like a common thread between the physical and metaphysical, and that it was all kind of connected together. Do you think that was she right? Was she onto something there in terms of the back and forth, that you could go back and forth between because there is a commonality, or was that just more allegorical?
Well, it depends the value you place on allegory. The manuscript, the record of Cleopatra, which means the blessing of the father, if I remember right. It doesn't mean Elizabeth Taylor.
No, and of course not. Yeah, no.
As far as we know, this lady Cleopatra was a Greco-Egyptian alchemist operating in the 1st century. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the interesting things about the book, is that I found so many of the early practitioners were women. This was actually a women's art. So it's almost on a par with embroidery and cooking again, these women's arts. Men got more involved later on, I dare say, when the money started to flow in. But I think originally it's to do with this. I can imagine the women being much more fascinated by the inside meaning of what they were doing. I mean, if you read Mary the prophetess, as she's called, the Jewish lady from probably Alexandria, you get the feeling that you're talking about a very canny cook who's developing these new recipes, but she also has the sense to develop the technology around it and is developing new kinds of equipment. As for Cleopatra and her perceptions, she's one of the first who leaves a record of an alchemical process which actually sounds like a fantasy, a novel. She talks about what would in fact be a little pile of substance in a crucible. She talks about it as if it was the mountain of initiation, she is a visionary. She's seeing the material, natural world as a place of infinite value and meaning, and that through chemistry, she's entering that world and manipulating it, and trying to bring substances to higher levels. But as one has to remember that the overall way of thinking about things in this period, the first century, was everything you were dealing with had a kind of infinite quality. It was to do with the gods. It was to do with you were contacting vast energies that were beyond perception. So naturally, it encouraged the imagination to see the whole thing on a kind of epic scale. We've, again, in the modern world, we've rather lost that. Especially now, we're into microscopy. Everything's very small and defined. Somebody once said a God defined is a finite God. And we have defined too much and made things that have infinite value finite. But Cleopatra was already pointing the way to a more sophisticated philosophical grasp of a chemical process. But it was a chemical process. It's very important. It was always about making things. It's a creative art.
Something I had wanted to ask you earlier, and I don't want to forget. Have you ever wondered, like, I think I might have brought it up in an episode that I did a while ago, questioning that sometimes, like, if some of these things that seem to be recipes, like when it came to alchemy, like, recipes for things, could they have actually have been ciphers? Like, have you?
No, there are plenty of ciphers already in the recipes. Very often there's a little gap and a symbol put in especially in the records that we have in the 10th century from Constantinople. If they wanted to cipher something, i.e. they wanted to keep something a little secret, they'd use a name for it that actually had no meaning other, it was just a code name, because they didn't want to pass their industrial secrets on. I mean, today, right. you don't know how to make Coca-Cola, because that has been ciphered off and is presumably in a safe somewhere, how to make Coca-Cola or Diet Coke or whatever it is. And I think it was the same with these chaps and ladies. They had to keep some of their secrets themselves. What we have in terms of literary evidence is only a tiny, 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 tiny part of what would have been a big industry, tiny part. And we must be careful and remember that the vast nature of this iceberg actually is invisible to us. We don't have the evidence to reconstruct the entire world that this is coming from. One thing we do know, we got little clues, very interesting stuff. In the 3rd century, there was an attempt by the Roman emperor he was very worried about the money that was going to revolutionary movements in Egypt. And the money was coming from, he believed, from this alchemy. And of course, people interpreted this meaning that they were making gold, which was buying the weapons for the insurrectionists. But what it was that these were wealthy merchants dealing with high quality goods, high quality sellable goods, and then using the profits to finance resistance to aspects of Roman rule. Anyway, he ordered all the books of alchemy to be burned. And
this is the Roman Emperor Diocletian or something like that.
Diocletian, yes. I have no doubt that he would have done that. That sounds absolutely logical for a fanatical, single-minded, ignorant, but very clever man like Diocletian. You would destroy it. You would suppress the knowledge. So I do think there was a suppression of the industry that was organized by Rome. And that is part of the reason I think that by the 7th century, a lot of the real meaning of these texts was lost, because the people who preserved the texts were monks, Christian monks, mostly.
Yes. Yes.
And what they read into them was the spiritual analogy. They saw these analogies and allegories of chemical processes, and they saw them as religious or spiritual texts.
Mm-hmm.
And not some of them would have condemned them as magical, i.e.
Yes.
Reliant on demons.
Yeah.
And others would have said this is actually a divine art. And the whole status of the chemistry changes when it's separated from the industry which created it. Same thing happened with Freemasonry in the 18th century. The original Masonic meetings were severed from the industry. And then it starts to become all theoretical and mystical and overly symbolic. Same thing happened with alchemy. Once it's removed from the practical industry, it starts to luxuriate in symbolism.
But do you think that was a way to preserve it, or do you think it just was by artifact that it was being kind of suppressed, and then therefore these we did an episode on occultist saints that were occultists, and they did take some of this alchemical work and look at it more from a spiritual sense. But it almost makes you wonder, did they do it on purpose to preserve it and kind of hide it behind the spiritual aspect to make it okay to continue on? Or was it just by artifact that it's being suppressed, but these people picked it up and then they themselves organically turned it into more of a spiritual slant?
Well, I'd suspect a little bit of all of that, really.
Okay.
There were people who were interested more in the practical and covered their interest with a kind of religious patina. And I think there were other people who thought it was the religious dimension that mattered, that they were dealing with religious texts. And there were some, all of the above, I think, would have happened. You just think about human nature and the way different intellects engage today or any time. I think all of that is all possible. We don't really know. That's the trouble. We don't have records of people debating these things. There's very little debate. There's a record of any debate. And of course, academically in the West, for the last 2,000 years, there's been very little interest, in actually finding out the roots of this art. People have been more interested in, like Isaac Newton. He was convinced that alchemy held fundamental physical secrets and spent a huge amount of time experimenting. He was looking for the secrets because the inherited corpus of alchemical literature suggested there was a secret in alchemy that was fundamental and totally transformative, which was symbolized in this idea of a stone, which was transformative. And of course, by the 16th century, it's become entirely theologized. So as Heinrich Kunrat writes in the Amphitheatrum Aeterni in 1598, the stone is Christ. So there is this notion that there is a divine presence in nature, which you have to extract. And that can transform anything, and especially the individual. So you've come a long way there from making votive objects and dyes. The original art, it's clear, was making dyes, D-Y-E, making dyes. And what is fascinating is that one of the great cities associated with the art in what's called the Thebaid in Upper Egypt, the area around Thebes, to this very day, Panopolis, where Zosimus came from, Zosimus of Panopolis, today is the Alchemy in Arabic, is still a textile center to this day. And I think this gives you a real conception of where this work was originally cited, what its natural world was, is in the world of textiles and luxury goods. That's how it starts. By a strange development, it also picks up on the spiritual and magical beliefs of the period in which it found its greatest success as an economic boom. And that goes on. And then alchemy becomes a kind of a shoe in which other spiritual aspirations are poured through the ages, and those spiritual aspirations change. So whenever there's a period of spiritual awareness, whether it was in the late Middle Ages or at the Renaissance or the alchemical revival in the 17th and 18th centuries, alchemy becomes important again. It becomes, you can't separate it from the spiritual movement. It's fascinating. And here we are again today in the post-60s conflict between materialism and tyranny and spirituality and freedom. We are interested in alchemy. We want to know what's going on within. We are led from within. That's how the spiritual being operates in the world. We are led from within. If we listen to dictators, tyrants, and so on, they want to lead us from without. There's no room in their universe for an individual star to operate. They want to take your star away, crush it, and have you led and bullied and pushed around. And what are post-60s, I say post-60s because I think the 60s was obviously a bit of a supernova of awareness, rough as it was. And
magical moment.
A magical moment, much abused, and all the rest of it. But inside all of that was a real spiritual awakening. Those of us who run the risk with it are interested in things like alchemy, and those who are not are interested in making material gold alone. I've just read John Densmore's book about the Doors. Do you know this book?
No.
It's fascinating. You know, the drummer of the Doors, John Densmore, the Doors, Jim Morrison's band.
Yes.
Yeah, I know who they are.
It's written a fascinating book about a legal case he waged in California between about 2004 to about 5 years later. And it's really it's a battle over the name of the Doors, who has the right to use it. But underneath the story is a battle between materialism and the spirit. And that's the battle, you know. If you watch the news, then matter has definitely won. If you watch this podcast, you may wonder if there isn't a better world going on all the time.
That's very well said.
You know, in Manly P. Hall's Occult Man, he makes references to exactly what you're saying at the beginning, and talking about how it is the spirit or the body itself is what allows for that marry between matter and spirit, and that and it's pretty much, you know, the signature of whatever that allows, I guess, to move between two, to pivot between two, or to be able to move between two.
Yes, we are the hidden God, and it's hidden from most people as well. And in that sense, occult, which means to be hidden or darkened as in an eclipse. But if you bring it forth from yourself, then it's not hidden anymore. It's open and clear. But the materialists will always be blind to it. They don't see it. They don't recognize it. But they recognize it enough to want to repress it.
This is true. This is true. Yes. That's very fascinating.
That was deep. Covered a lot of things, and I'm trying to look at some of the questions I have, and I think you touched on a lot of them throughout it. Not to kind of like backtrack, because I really thought that you were saying some great stuff right here, but I did want to also kind of like, I guess, go back to besides like a lot of equipment. I mean, I do think that there has been a lot of breakthroughs that humanity has been benefited from due to alchemists. I think just in equipment made. But do you think there's any other like neither inventions or other ways? Like I would question like that, would chemistry exist without alchemy?
You're absolutely right. I mean, chemistry is simply something that develops out of the alchemical enthusiasm of people like Robert Boyle and Van Helmont and all the early scientific masters of chemistry were deeply into alchemy. They had no problem with it at all. It was like a generation or two later, and they say, well, we've got the alchemical, we've got the chemistry, we don't need the other stuff, But that process took a long, long time, and it was through the refinement of chemistry into a series of formulae and mathematical formulae. The world of chemistry became a closed world, open only to the mathematician and the physical scientist. And since you couldn't objectify the spiritual, you can't see it, you can't put it under a microscope, and you certainly can't measure it. It's gradually become a kind of irrelevance to the scientist. So the spiritual dimension is really a matter of how you feel about things or all that sort of stuff. It's whether you feel something that's subjective, but objective knowledge is the measurable universe. But do we think that these people who first experimented and discovered the value of evaporation, distillation, and all the processes that happen to different materials in different quantities in different kinds of vessels, do we think that they reached those conclusions rationally? No, they reached them intuitively and through trial and error and through leaps of genius when they say, that works. And a recipe is a very simple thing, but imagine a world where there were no recipes. Could you just dream them up? Could you think them up through a formula? No, you've got to actually work with the material. And we can refine recipes. This is true. Of course, chemistry is alchemy. That's my point of the book is that there is no difference. Alchemy is chemistry. It's just understood at a different period with a different set of criteria. Modern chemistry is modern chemistry, and so-called alchemy is just an earlier version of chemistry. Some of its presumptions we may find less useful today, but we'd be foolish to let it go. I'm sure that scientists in the future, scientists, whatever that means, does it mean I studied science? What does it mean? What's a scientist? Is it a person in a white coat who appears to know everything? Science just is knowledge, and new knowledge banishes old knowledge. So yesterday's scientist, is a superstitious fool. Tomorrow's scientist thinks he knows it all, and then 100 years' time, he's a superstitious fool. But there are fundamental human perceptions which never change, and so no, if you said to me, should we get rid of the word alchemy and just call it early chemistry or something, I'd be inclined to say yes, but the problem with that is you would then be tied to the idea that chemistry has refined itself into something advanced. And in that sense, we'd be losing all this other dimension that clearly fascinates and involves a lot of people. And we'd be also losing the idea that chemistry is universal. It's not about just guys in laboratories with a Bunsen burner and laser photographic equipment and measuring devices and all this stuff. Chemistry is about making music. It's about making love. It's about making buildings. It's about making ourselves. Chemistry is about it's about creation. One thing Zosimus realized was whatever is going on in the alchemical process is what's going on making the universe. It's a clue.
Microcosm, macrocosm.
Exactly. You are engaging with the microcosm.
Yes.
So
and it's a mirror from the micro to the macro.
Yeah, and because of that, it can be a path to God. Yes. And God is pure perception. It's just perceiving things purely as they are, to quote William Blake, infinite. It is the engagement with the infinite which lifts man back in the direction of his original status, apokatastasis, to return to our real being. We are fallen creatures, and our chemistry is fallen. It's maimed, and along with it, our souls. And the tragedy is that the way out of that is only sought by a few, and I presume will ever more be so, which is a tragedy in a world of democracy. If we could have an autocracy of the few who see, we wouldn't need democracy.
That's very interesting. I like that.
You know, because the right of the individual would be the absolute dedication of the rule. You know, the right of the individual to rise to their highest potential. I think that's what alchemy is really about. I mean, alchemy, I think, holds the key to human development.
Yeah, no.
The principles involved in it.
No, I very much have thought that myself. Yeah, I mean, I do know, like, you know, we were talking before, there is like so many different ways of, I guess, of like looking at alchemy, from cooking to tarnishing spoons to look like gold to a change within themselves. I did what I had gotten out of the idea of alchemy, I guess maybe in a spiritual and occult sense. It was about actually one's change within themselves to have like a spiritual experience or a divine experience with God or something along those means. You know, that's
but that ought to come from just working sensibly with the material. That was Zosimus's view. You would, through working sensibly with the material, you would get more and more acquainted with the way of God in the world. So in that sense, it's a kind of, you could say it's a kind of yoga or system of union, you know, to unify yourself with the source of matter. You got to remember that Zosimus in the 4th century believed that the art of alchemy had been brought by wicked angels to man, and that it was an illegitimate science insofar as human beings that to begin with were not ready to receive it, that it was brought to them illegitimately from heaven. He got this idea from the book of Enoch, a very, very important Hebrew text, which had a lot of currency in Upper Egypt in his time and before. There's 7 fragmentary versions of it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which was a revolution to discover that, by the way, because it had only ever been known before that in an Ethiopian version brought back in 1784 to Europe by James Bruce, the Laird of Kinnaird. The Book of Enoch suggested that all these arts and sciences came from rebel angels and were taught to man deliberately to pervert them. So Zosimus was really saying, we have this knowledge, we can abuse it. That's why it was brought here, for us to lead to our destruction. But if we remember that the knowledge originally came from heaven and therefore is divine, then we can use it sensibly. Very interesting viewpoint. And it chimes in also with our suspicion today that our leaders in the world, so-called leaders, power mongers, they have knowledge that they're not entitled to, and they're as demented as the silly people who were seduced by these evil angels in the Book of Enoch, and will abuse this knowledge. And we certainly see that in the amount of missiles and explosives that are being thrown around the world at the moment. I mean, there's your abuse of alchemy. I mean, if everything in metallurgical science has been devoted since, you name it, when gunpowder was made, to killing people, not to decorate beautiful statues and make the world a more interesting place and to develop the art. It's developed to kill people. And the greatness of a country depends on how many missiles they've got. Kim Jong-un in Korea wants more missiles. He thinks it'll make them great. Trump thinks if America has more missiles, it'll make America great. Putin thinks if he has more missiles, it'll make them great. And the one with the biggest number of missiles wins the game. What the game is, I really don't understand. What they achieve, I don't understand, but neither do they.
You think they're all trying to make up for a small dick?
Yeah, absolutely. They haven't got the missile. That's exactly what they're missing.
Oh, I'm done.
They haven't found the secret of alchemy. They've only found that they are, in fact, dupes. They are dupes of it. And I wish this was voiced on our conventional media, how pathetic our leaders are. Instead of reporting their word as if it mattered, they should be treated as children, silly children, naughty. In fact, that's an insult to children. Yeah. You know, ridiculous 12-year-old teenagers. They should be shown to be the adolescent, undeveloped, spiritually immature pricks that they really are.
Yes.
And that instead of deciding whether you vote for this particular idiot or that one, we should decide, do we want to vote for idiots? And are we ourselves idiots to fall for this?
Even standing in line and voting for them?
Absolutely. Right? I mean, you know, it's the whole situation has become grotesque. I do like to say this when I talk about my work, because some people say, oh, you know, it's all esoteric, meaning irrelevant for a few. Only a few people will grasp it. My thing is that things I've studied are not for a few at all. The message is explosive and could be of universal significance. What it would take for that to happen, I don't know. I do know this, though, that if the world goes in the current way it appears to be going, your show won't last very long.
Oh, no.
Well, let's hope not. Let's hope more people wake up.
Yeah,
let's hope more people pay attention.
Trying. We'll see, though. We'll see. I'll have to switch over to paranormal stuff.
It's getting too heavy for you.
Yeah. Okay, I'll just switch over to something else. Was there anything else that you wanted to ask, Lisa?
Me?
No,
I didn't come on the show to ask.
Wait. I do have a question, Because in the work that I was looking at, and I'm a novice at this, I'm barely diving in, and so please correct me. It was my understanding that most of this stuff, especially the stuff that the Western esoteric and occult philosophies, it all came from the Middle East, and it if anything, it was mainly derived from Arabic texts. And then when I read your work, it said how most of this has come from Upper Egypt.
Yes.
And so I was like, I guess I just didn't dive deep enough to see the full history of it. And then, of course, you hear the word alchemy and how it has Arabic origin, and you're just like, okay, so chicken or egg? Like, what's going on here?
That just happened because when Western Europeans, Spanish scholars particularly, and then French and English scholars, and later German, got hold of it, the only texts they had were translations from Arabic texts.
Okay.
Those Arabic translations were very often translations from Syriac and from Greek. And the earliest texts we have are Greek. So, which was the lingua franca, the common language of the Roman Empire.
Okay. And that would be what, 3 BC, 30 BC, in terms of the earliest texts?
The earliest texts that we have that are definitely, we could say, alchemical, were written in the 1st century, so same time as Jesus and Paul and all that, interestingly enough. But the actual earliest papyri we have of those are from the 4th century, which is sort of the 300s, so about 300 years later than that. And there obviously would have been far, far more, but the things that have been discovered were found really in tombs. They were buried with people who cared about these texts. But there are, they are extremely rare and limited, and it's a miracle that we have what we have. And then the other source of texts were a Greek text gathered in Constantinople between the 7th century and about the year 1000. And they were put in large folios, and those are our main sources. The Arab influence of chemistry, the Arabs after the 7th century definitely were more interested in the strictly chemical aspects, and used the knowledge to make different kinds of acids and alkalis, and they were interested in the application of chemistry to medicine. When I say they, well, we're not necessarily talking about Arabs in the racial sense. We talk about people who lived under the rule of the caliphs who'd taken over the Middle East by the end of the 7th century.
Right. That makes sense now.
Yeah, I remember you even asking that before the show.
Yeah.
I'm glad you got that in.
No, I did. Yeah, because, you read, and then people say different things. That's another thing. Some scholars say this, and then other scholars argue this. And so you kind of left with, well, what is what? So.
Yeah. Well, there's scholarship and scholarship.
Yeah, this is true. I almost regretted saying the word scholar when it came out of my mouth. So I understand completely.
If it makes sense, that's the best thing. The aim of scholarship is to simply simplify, not in the sense of make it simplistic or easy, but just to separate the wood from the trees. You can, when you make a real discovery, a lot of things become clear, and that's how it's been for me. That's why I've been writing these books. It's for me a kind of therapy to. I don't like the word therapy, but just a way of clarifying thought, and suddenly things that seem very, very difficult and dense become much clearer if you're honest with yourself and the subject, and don't obscure it with romanticism and your fantasies. It's nice when you're young to be romantic about these things. Later, there's a higher.
All that.
Well, romanticism is fascinating because it's a sort of mixture of dream states and imagination, and it's motivating. Later on, you should develop and refine your thoughts to a more spiritual level.
I like that. I think, I think we covered a lot. We actually, I think, went a little bit deeper in certain aspects than I even had expected, which I thought was great. Thank you very much. I think you kind of answered this question, but I figured maybe before we wrap it up, I will kind of, I guess, maybe ask it in this sense. Do you think alchemy is very important to today, and more people should be into maybe?
I think I made almost overstated.
Yeah, I know. I was gonna leave the show off like that. And I was like, he's kind of said it already, but I'll just ask anyway.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's of no interest to people who are not interested in it. What I would say, people who are interested in it are not wasting their time.
Love that.
Well said.
Very well said. I don't think we can end it any better way. Tobias, do you want to let people know where they could find your book and your stuff?
All good bookstores, Barnes and Noble, and that stuff. On my website, tobiaschurton.com, I think there are some links to Barnes and Noble. I think whatever, if you want to order it through Amazon,
okay.
Links to that. Have a look at the Amazon Tobias Churton page. There's a lot there, and a lot on my website that will give you a clear idea of my background and the things I care about the most.
Okay, great. And I will leave your obviously his site, and I'll leave some links for his books. They will all be in the show notes, so check out the show notes for his links. Lisa, thank you very much for coming on. I really had a great time. Yeah, I was really glad that you joined us again, because we had just covered stuff like this. And thank you very much, Tobias. That was really an amazing conversation. I really had a good time. I'm sure in the future I could probably have you back on for another topic. There was a lot of things you've actually wrote about that I find very interesting. But again, I really appreciate it. I thought that was an amazing chat. In my opinion, if people are paying attention, he said some real deep shit. That's just my opinion. Especially if you've had the experiences, he said some real deep shit. So that's just me. Maybe I'm taking it the wrong way, but I think he said some real deep. He definitely said some deep shit that caught my attention. I was like, "Whoa, he just said what?" So pay attention to this man. I think he has some stuff that you might be able to learn from, or you'll hear. Oh, I think Nick said that in a different way. So thank you very much for coming on. You made my day. I really appreciate it. I had a really good conversation. It was fun. And
thank you very much for the opportunity.
Sure, no, for sure. Perfect fit for the show. And until the next one, everybody be well. Later.